To file murder charges against people who sell a fatal dose of dangerous drugs. Nebraska, not one of them.
As 6 News' John Chapman reports tonight, some Nebraska lawmakers want to increase the penalties for drug dealers in our state.
Earlier this year, Omaha police were called to an apartment building near 70th and Haskell. 2 women died of an overdose. 2 others ended up in the hospital. There are states that would have charged the person who sold the fatal dose of drugs with a serious crime.
I think it's a growing trend around the country to increase the penalties for drug dealers that are distributing drugs that are creating the overdose deaths.
Omaha City Council member Amy Melton wants the city to support a bill if introduced to state lawmakers to increase the penalties for people who sell fatal doses of drugs.
If a person supplies drugs that somebody overdoses on, currently they can only be charged with a class 4 felony. They can get probation.
Omaha lobbyist Jack Chiloa will carry that support and a number of other Omaha proposals to change state law to Lincoln. He says by working together, they hope to get the attention of state lawmakers.
Typically, there's usually an omnibus crime bill that goes through, and we'll coordinate with the Sheriff's Association, with the Attorney General's office, and hopefully to get parts of our puzzle plugged into the big bill, and hopefully it'll become a law.
Councilmember Melton says if introduced, it should become law, and a tough one.
It should be a charge of homicide. It shouldn't just be as simple as drug distribution where you can potentially go to drug court or just get on probation. We need to get serious about the drugs that are being provided to our kids, and we need to start with the people that are providing them.
On your side in Omaha, I'm John Chapman, 6 News.
Harsh sentences aren't the best deterrent, especially for drug dealers. The first session of the 108th Nebraska legislature is scheduled to convene January 4th.